what's so special about Revit anyhow? Well, there are many possible answers to that question, but in this movie, I'd like to focus on one of the easiest and most immediate benefits of using Revit. Whether you're an architect, interior designer, draftsman, or contractor, you spend a lot of time looking at and working in floor plans, sections, and elevations. In Revit, work that you do in plan is immediately reflected in the elevations and sections and vice versa. In this movie, I'll show you how easy Revit makes it for us to keep our changes coordinated with a first-hand look at what I think is one of the fundamental benefits of building information modeling, the fully coordinated building model. So to illustrate this, I have several windows tiled on my screen. I've got a floor plan, an elevation, a 3D view, and even a schedule. Now what I'm going to do is click over here into my floor plan to make that the active view. And then I'll use this little magnifying glass over here to zoom in on the right-hand side of the plan. Now you'll notice I have a few doors shown over here, and I'm going to select this exterior door right here. And I want you to watch the 3D view and the elevation as I select this door. Notice how it highlights in blue here in the plan, but it also highlights in blue in the other two locations as well. That's because these are not three separate disconnected drawings. These are in fact just three different views of the same model. Now that's true of not just selecting, it also is true if I take this door and I click and hold down and I just sort of drag it a little bit. Now when I do that, notice how it moves in both the elevation and in the 3D. Let me do that again so you can watch it more carefully. Watch the 3D view and watch the elevation as I drag this door. Now, if I click an empty space, it deselects the door and it deselects it in all views. It's no longer selected. Now, what about this door schedule here? Well, notice that I've got door 12 here, door 9 here, door 10, door 11. I can actually click on the entries in the schedule. There's door 9, door 10, door 11, and they highlight not only in the schedule, but they actually highlight there in the plan as well. Now, back up here, I've got door number 5. Now, that's not shown in my plan because I'm currently zoomed in too close to see it. So what I'm going to do is just take my wheel on my mouse and just roll it back a few clicks so that I can zoom out and then drag my wheel over here. And there's door number 5 right there. It's sitting over here in this conference room area. So let me roll the wheel in again to zoom in on that location. Now, in addition to being able to just sort of drag the object around, there's other changes we can make as well. And sometimes we can make those changes directly in a schedule view. Doesn't really matter whether we make it in plan, elevation, section, or even schedule. So for example, if I click on door number 5 here, and then come over to this drop-down field right here, you can see I have some other options available. And I can choose a different size door, and you'll see that door shrink slightly and become a little bit smaller. You'll also see the numbers here reflect that change immediately. Maybe I want to get a better look at that door from another vantage point. I'd like to actually look right at it. Well, I don't actually have a view that currently shows me that. So that's another great benefit of Revit is that we can create views on the fly anytime we need to look at and study different aspects of the model. So what I'm going to do is click back over here in the floor plan. And then up here, I'm going to choose this little section tool. This is one of my favorite Revit tools. I'll click a point here outside the conference room, and then I'll just sort of drag to the right and click again. And that's going to create a new section view for me. Now I'm going to click away from it and then double click the blue section head to open up that view. Now let me just resize this a little bit just so I can continue to see the door there in the background and then roll my wheel so that I can continue to see the door here in the section view. Now if I select it here, of course it selects in the floor plan as well. And maybe I decide I want to change that to a double door. It's as easy as coming over here and making that selection. It turns into a double door here. It turns into a double door there in the floor plan. And once again, the schedule stays up to date as well by reflecting that new size and the changes that I indicated there. Now, when I was focusing on this conference room, I noticed here with this section that there's actually another door that needs attention. This door right here seems to be in the wrong spot. Well, if I verify that by opening up a second floor plan, I can see in fact that that door is in fact in the wrong spot. And again, just dragging it right here, you're going to see it change immediately in both views. So one of the best benefits of working in Revit is the changes that you make in one view are immediately applied in all other views. You won't spend your days constantly tracking down changes and repeating the same edit over and over again. A single change in the model is a single change in the model, and it will immediately be reflected in all views. And that's the power of working in a building information modeling paradigm and using the Revit software to do it. In this movie, I'm going to expose you to some of the high-level organization and hierarchy that's built into the Revit software. It's important to understand how all of the different objects and elements in the Revit platform fit into a broader structure. So we'll start with at the top level and we'll kind of work our way down. So every element in Revit is part of a category. Those categories are built into the software and they come from a fixed list. Beneath those categories, we can have subgroupings, and we call those groupings families. And then those families can either be subgrouped even further into types, and then finally we have the objects themselves that we can select in our projects and our models. Now going back to the top level, that category level, those categories break down into certain sort of overall groupings that Revit understands that are very important to impart certain basic functionality into the objects. Now, I like to call these groupings buckets because I don't really have a better word for them, but there's really a few major groupings. We have our model elements, we have our view specific or annotation elements, and then we have some special case elements like the view elements and the datum elements. So let's talk first about what the difference is between, say, a model element and on the opposite end of a spectrum, say an annotation element. A model element is quite simply anything that represents a real thing. So if you think about the building when it's all done and you walk out with your hard hat and you actually can put your hand on it and touch it, then it was a model element. So that would include things like these walls over here, things like these doors over here, this stair and railing. Those are all model elements. They physically exist. You can put your hand on them and touch them. The behaviors of all the model elements that they share in common is you create them in any view and they show in all views. We saw examples of that in the previous movie. So if you make a change to a model element in one view, you can be very confident that it's going to change everywhere. The model elements are drawn full size, actual size, full scale. So those are some of the characteristics of model elements. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we could contrast that with many view-specific elements. And what I mean by view-specific elements is these are elements that belong specifically to the view. But specifically, I'm talking about annotation elements. Now, there's lots of different kinds of annotation elements. We have things like dimensions. We have things like this bar scale right here, this north arrow, these labels and tags. All of those things are necessary for architectural communication, but they're not real elements. Nobody paints the dimensions or the bar scale or the tags on the floor of the building. They're not actually physical objects. Furthermore, those objects only exist in the view that they're created in. So notice that I'm in a level 1 floor plan view right here, and it has several room tags, several wall tags, door tags. It has dimensions. There's lots of different annotation elements. Well, I also have a level 1 power plan. And if you look at it, you'll notice that the layout is exactly the same because it's got the same walls, the same doors, the same windows, but notice that it has very different annotation. There's only a couple dimensions. The room tags are outside the rooms and they're in totally different locations. Now, we saw in the previous movie that if we say zoom in right here and I grab this door and I move it over here, then we're going to expect to see that change occur in all places throughout the model. And in fact, it does. The door has moved in any version of this floor plan. However, if I took this corner tag right here and I moved it over here, and then I go back to the level 1 power plan, this room tag is unchanged because in fact, there are two different room tags because they're view specific. Now, another reason why that's the case is because annotation elements or view specific elements respond to scale. So this view is set to 1 to 100. When I change the scale, none of the model geometry will change, but all of the annotation will. So if I change it to 1 to 50, notice that all of the tags have just gotten smaller, but of course all of the model geometry remains exactly the same. So that's those sort of major buckets, right? And the difference between model and annotation is a pretty big distinction. And keep that in mind as you work in Revit because we're going to see those behaviors again and again. And the more you understand how they behave, the more you can begin to predict things in the Revit environment. Now, another really important hierarchical concept is the concept of category family type. So I mentioned it briefly, but let me dig into it a little bit more in detail. The categories are built into the software. So there's things like walls, doors, windows, text, dimensions. These are all categories, and they just impart certain behaviors and features on all of the elements in our Revit project. Now, talking about walls is a pretty broad category. Talking about doors is a pretty broad category. If we think about a door is a hole in a wall that we can pass through, but doors come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and kinds. So right here on this screen, I have a single door and a double door. Those are pretty different from one another, even though we recognize them both as being doors. Well, the difference between this single door and this double door would be what we would call a family in Revit. So a family is a little bit more specific designation, and it defines much more specific characteristics than just the broad grouping of the category. Another example is furniture. All of these items here are furniture, but a desk is very different than a chair, which is very different than a credenza. All of them are considered furniture, they're part of the furniture category, but the desk, the chair, and the credenza are different families. Now, even within each family, you often have variations, and those are called types. So if I took this door right here and come over here to this list, you'll notice that it actually has several different variations. Now, the types describe really just different sizes. So I could drop this door to a different size, and in all ways, it's very similar to the other doors within the same family, but now it's just a slightly smaller size. So by working your way down from category to family to type, you progressively get more and more specific on the kinds of things that you can change. But one of the important characteristics to understand is that all objects at the same tier of the hierarchy share common characteristics. In other words, if you change something about this type, it would affect all other instances of that type. So this door right here, this is exactly the same type right here. If I made a change to that type, this one would be affected as well. If I made a change to the family, both of these doors would be affected even though they're different types. And then, of course, if I made a change at the category level, it would affect all doors, including this one out here. So the hierarchy basically tells us at what level our modifications are going to take place. Are they going to affect only the object we have selected? Are they going to affect a group of objects? Or are they going to affect an entire category of objects? And we get to decide what those behaviors will be and how far-reaching our edits are made just in the choices we make and in understanding how that hierarchy in Revit functions. So as we go through the course, we'll be seeing plenty of examples of that, and we'll get plenty of opportunities to learn the specifics of why we might want to dig in and make changes at all those various levels. Much of what you do in the Revit environment is context sensitive. What I mean by that is when you're manipulating certain objects or when you're executing certain commands, the interface will actually change to reflect the context of the command or the object that you're manipulating. The two places where you're going to see this happen most frequently is on the ribbon and on the options bar. So let's talk about those two critical interface elements here in this movie. So let's start with context ribbons that will appear when you select objects. So I'm going to go to the Modify tab here first, and I want to show you what the default Modify tab looks like. So this is the default Modify tab when there's no command active and when there are no objects selected. So we have our Properties panel, our Clipboard panel, Geometry, all the way over to Measure and Create on the far right side. If I come into my model here and I select an object like this roof here, notice that the left-hand side of the Modify tab remains exactly the same, but we now get an additional Mode panel on the far right, and the whole thing tints in this sort of greenish color. If I click away from that to deselect, that context portion will disappear, and the Modify tab goes back to saying just Modify. Let me select another object and show you again. Here's the door object on screen. Notice now the Modify tab says Modify Doors, and we get a couple different buttons that appear that are related to the context of the selected door. So in other words, each of those buttons on the context portion of the ribbon would pertain to the selection. So we could pick a new host for the door, for example, or we could edit that door family. And you're going to see that depending on the kind of object you select, you may get more or fewer of these context-sensitive buttons. So we get several buttons when it's a group, but maybe only one button when it's a topo surface, for example. So it will vary depending on the object and what commands are available. Now, the other place where you're going to see similar context buttons is when you're actually creating objects. So if I go to the Architecture tab and I just click the Wall tool, for example, notice that that takes me to the Modify tab. And again, the left-hand portion of the Modify tab is exactly the same as it was a moment ago, but then we get that context-sensitive portion off to the right, and it now says Modify Place Wall instead of just Modify, and we get all the draw shapes over there on the right-hand side. Now, in addition to that, when I'm in the Wall command, I'm also getting a whole collection of options available on the Options bar. Now, the Options bar is that big slot of space there directly below the ribbon. Now, if I come over here and I click the Modify tool or press Escape twice and cancel completely out of the command, Notice that the options bar is now completely blank. So the space is still there, but there are no options available because I'm not doing anything. Now, sometimes when you select an object, it will put options on the options bar. It didn't do it with the door. It didn't do it here with the roof. But in some cases, you will get options that will appear on the options bar. Like when I select this topo surface, I get the activate dimensions button. But more often than not, the options bar gets populated when you're creating objects as opposed to when you select existing ones. But in either case, you really want to pay attention to what displays on that options bar and on those context sensitive ribbons while you're working, because all of those tools are going to be highly sensitive to what it is you're actually doing. So it's changing all the time. And so after a while, you'll get used to that. But certainly initially, when you're learning Revit, you want to pay close attention to those interface elements so that you know what features and options are available to you as you work. In this movie, we're going to talk about the properties palette. The properties palette is one of the primary interface elements that you use to manipulate objects both while you're creating them and then after they're created when you want to make changes to them in your model. Properties palette by default is located on the left-hand side of the screen just below the ribbon, but it can actually be located in other parts of the screen as well. So yours might be in a different location, which is fine if that's your preference. If you don't see the properties palette at all, then what you're going to want to do is come over here to the View tab, and using the user interface dropdown, make sure that you put a check mark right here to display that properties palette. So it is actually possible to hide it, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. So let's look at ways that the properties palette will help us while we're working. The first way that you're going to interact with the properties palette is when you're creating new objects. So for example, if I come over here to the architecture tab and click on the wall button, now don't worry too much about the specifics of the wall command just yet. We're going to talk about those in a future movie. But when I look over at the properties palette, you're going to see that there's some settings that pertain to the wall that I'm about to draw. So I'm about to draw a generic 140 millimeter wall. And if I begin clicking points, you can see that I'm creating segments of that wall. Now let's say I wanted to change some of those settings to something else. Well, notice that the properties palette is grayed out. So while you're drawing walls, you can't make the change. But if you want to make the change, you just simply press the escape key one time. That will cancel the current draw action, but keep you in the wall command. And notice now that all the property settings are available to manipulate. So I could open up the type selector here at the top and choose a different size wall, like maybe this generic 200 millimeter wall. And then I could continue drawing, and you can see that those walls are slightly thicker than the other ones. To get all the way out of the command, you can press escape twice, or you can just simply click this modify tool right here, and that will cancel out and get you back to a 0 state. So that's manipulating the properties palette while you're drawing new elements. But what about elements that already exist in your model? Well, to see their properties, you just simply select them. So for example, if I select this exterior wall over here on the left-hand side of the plan, notice that the properties is now displaying that particular wall. So that particular wall is an exterior brick on metal stud. It's set to the wall center line. It's at level 1. You can see the various properties that are associated with that object. Right here is another small drop-down menu, and it says currently walls, and in parentheses, the number 1. So what that's telling me is 2 bits of information. It's telling me the category of the selected object, which is walls, and it's telling me how many walls I have selected, currently just 1. Now, we can manipulate this existing object in the same way that we did when we were drawing new ones over here. For example, if I opened up the type selector and chose my generic 200 millimeter wall, notice that that wall will get a little bit thinner in place right where it is. Now, assuming you wanted to not actually keep that change, you can undo it. So I can just come over here to the quick access toolbar and click the undo command, or you can press Control Z, and that will restore it to its original state. Now, remember that I had walls and it said quantity 1. Well, let me select that same wall again, hold down the control key, and I'm going to select a second wall. Now, the control key is how you add to your existing selection. As long as it's held down, it will add other objects. Now, we're going to talk about lots of ways to select in future movies, but for now, we'll just use that simple method. Notice the only difference on the properties palette is the quantity right here in parentheses. It says 2. Everything else is the same. Brick on metal stud, wall center line, level 1, because these walls share the same properties. Now, you certainly could open up the menu and make changes to that selection, but I just want you to really pay close attention to that quantity. And here's the real important reason why. I currently have 2 walls selected. But what if it said 5 walls or 8 walls or 10 walls and I thought I only had two? When you make a change, anything you do here is affecting the entire selection. So you really want to be cautious of that because you might be modifying objects that you're not aware of. Let me show you an example of that here in the south elevation. So if you come over here to the project browser, double click the south elevation, you're going to be looking right at an elevation view of this model. And I'm going to roll my wheel slightly to zoom in on this window. Now, if I select that window, you can see that it's a casement window. It's at level 1, and it currently has a sill height of 950 millimeters. Let's say I wanted to move that window. Let's put it at 600 millimeters. Well, notice nothing's happened yet. When you make a change on the properties palette, you have to actually apply that change. Now, there's 2 ways to apply it. You can either use this apply button right here, and that will apply the change, move the window down. Or, let's say I wanted to put it back to 915. Shifting your mouse away from the properties palette will actually apply the change. Now, the program is called as shifting focus. So if I shift focus off of the properties palette back to the drawing window, it will apply the change for me automatically. And that was actually what was happening back in the previous view, in the floor plan view, when we were applying a different type. By moving the mouse away, it was automatically applying the change. Now, as I talked about just a moment ago, if you select more than one element with the control key, in some cases, if those elements aren't the same kind of element, you might see different things happen in the properties palette. Now, in this case, they're both windows, so we still get quantity of 2, but you want to be cautious here because it says multiple families are selected. And what does that mean exactly? Well, let's say that I just went ahead and made a change here. I'm going to pick a fixed window, maybe this size right here in the middle, and you can see that that's a pretty dramatically different change from what was there a moment ago. Now, that may be your intention, but it may not. And so this is where the caution that I was giving you a moment ago is to pay attention to the quantity of what you actually have selected, because the change you make on the properties palette is going to affect the entire selection. So let me go ahead and undo that. And I'm going to return to the level 1 floor plan. And I'm going to show you one last example of a multiple selection and what you want to be aware of here. Suppose I select a toilet. The category for that is plumbing fixture and quantity of 1. Now I can hold the control key and select a second toilet, and it's still plumbing fixtures, now quantity of 2. But what happens if I hold the control key and I select an item that's not a plumbing fixture, like this wall? Well, now the filter selection is going to change to common, telling me that these are the properties that these multiple categories share in common. And really, it's just comments. Okay, so about the only thing you could do to walls and toilets at the same time would be to add some comments to them. However, what I want to point out here is that this filter is actually a drop-down list. So by keeping the selection active on screen, all 3 elements are still selected. You can actually reach in and focus your edits on different categories within that selection. So here's the 2 plumbing fixtures, and I could make changes. Here's the 1 wall, and I could make changes. And then also, you actually have access to the floor plan itself. So without losing the selection, if you wanted to make a change to the floor plan, change its scale or its level of detail, you could switch to the floor plan itself and get access to those settings as well. So as you can see, the properties palette is a very powerful user interface element that allows you to manipulate objects not only as they're being created, but after they've been created within your model, and make changes not only to individual objects, but to large collections of objects all at once. And just really pay close attention to those subtle little nuances that appear on that properties palette, because it can make a big difference in the kinds of edits that you get. The Revit project is a complete virtual building model that can be viewed, edited, and explored 3-dimensionally, 2-dimensionally, and in various reports and tabular lists. Each such representation of the project is referred to in Revit as a view. Views are listed and accessed from the project browser palette, which functions much like a table of contents for your project. So similar to how you have a table of contents telling you where you would locate various aspects of a book, you can use the project browser to help you locate the various views within your project. So let's start with where the project browser is located, which by default is over on the left-hand side of the screen, directly below the properties palette. Now, I have the default installation. Your project browser might be located somewhere else on the screen, or it may not be displayed at all. If it's not displayed at all, you can use the tool on the View tab, the user interface tool that we looked at in the previous movie. At the very top of the project browser, you'll have a branch called Views. In parentheses next to that branch, it says the word All. Now, all is simply the name of what we call a browser organization. Now, when I select views here, you'll notice that the properties palette actually changes to reflect the selection, just like it did in all the examples that we explored in the previous movie. So up here, it says browser views, and then there's the type called all. And there actually are some other types that we could choose from, but for this movie, we're going to stick with the default grouping of all, which just simply means it's going to display all of the views within your project. Some of those other types would actually filter out the list and show a limited subset of views, and in some cases that might be appropriate. Now beneath that, you see different branches for the different kinds of views. Now these branches are named after your most common types of drawings that you would have in architectural production. So we have a floor plans branch, we have a ceiling plans branch, we have elevations, we have sections. Now, when you scroll down a little bit further, there's also a legends branch, schedules and quantities, sheets, families, and even Revit links down toward the bottom. Now, we're going to look at some of these other branches in future movies throughout the course, so we won't necessarily explore every single one of them here. But they all function in a similar way. You can expand open the branch, and then beneath that will be indented whatever views belong to that branch. So for example, let's say I wanted to look at the second floor plan of this model. So I locate my floor plans branch and then expand it if it's not already expanded, and then just simply double click level 2 to open up that floor plan. Now, I'm going to use simple navigation methods in this movie, but we're going to talk about navigation in a future movie, but you can use the wheel and just zoom in and out, and you can drag with the wheel to pan if necessary. So this is a floor plan of the project from the second floor. We also have third floor plans and a roof plan and so on. There are ceiling plans, there are elevations. Now, down here, I've got two sections, section 1 and section 2. Now, in many cases, the views will actually have on-screen representations as well. So you can see over here that there is a section cutting all the way through the building model. And if I just kind of pause my mouse over that, it should give me a little tooltip on screen telling me what view that is. So you can see that that vertically cut section there is actually section 1, which corresponds to this view right here on Project Browser. And if I do the same thing with this section, that's section 2, and you can see it listed right here on the browser. So you can open these sections in one of two ways. You can either double click directly on that item in the project browser, the same way we open the floor plan, or here's that section 1 again, because we're now cutting through the building, looking at that section 2, and it intersects with section 1. And if the tooltip doesn't display on screen, you can look down at the status bar at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. So notice at the bottom left-hand corner, I see Views, Section 1. That's the same information that we would have seen in the tooltip, and you can see that it points to that Section 1 that we have there in the browser. You can open the section directly from the on-screen control here. So there's two ways you could do that. You could either double-click this blue section head here, and it kind of functions like a hyperlink in a web browser. And you can see that will open that one up. Or you could actually highlight the section marker, right-click, and choose Go to View, and that would take me right back to section 2 there. So there's a couple different ways that you can navigate around the various views in your project, either by using the on-screen indicators or by double-clicking them over here in the project browser. Notice that the level heads are also in that blue color. And if I highlight over that, it says the same thing. Go to the floor plan that corresponds to this level. So if I wanted to return to my level 2 floor plan, I can double click the level head to get back there as well. All right, now let's direct our attention back over to the browser and a few other functions that we can do over there. Now, it should be fairly evident that these little minus signs here can be clicked and they become plus signs, and that will either collapse or expand that grouping. So if you have a project with lots of views and you want to make it easier to scroll through that list, you can easily collapse down the views that you're not using at the moment to make it easier to scroll. You can also search anywhere in the browser to find views. Now, in this project, it's a very simple project. There's not that many views. But in projects back in your office, you might have hundreds of views in some cases in the browser, and so it can be difficult to locate them. Just simply right-click anywhere in the browser, and you can access a search feature. And when you do that, it will display a dialog, and you can begin typing in what you want to search for. So, for example, if I just type in the word section and then I click next, notice that it will go to the sections branch, then it will go to section 1, section 2, and so on. So if you type in something very specific in the search field, it'll go to maybe just a few views. And if you type in a more broad keyword, then it might actually have several views for you to filter through. Let me go ahead and close that. Now, in some cases, there are other right-click options available as well. So really, the best thing you can do is just sort of right-click on the various parts of the browser and see what comes up. Notice when I right-click here on the elevations branch, I only get search, but if I right-click on an actual view, an elevation in this case, I get lots of choices. I can open that view, I can duplicate it, I can delete it, rename it. So in some cases, the right-click menu will offer you many, many more choices. So the project browser contains all of the views that are available in your project, and we can use it to open views, navigate views, rename them, duplicate them. We can do a variety of things. So make sure that your project browser is open and in a nice, convenient location on your screen so that you have easy access to all the views in your project. If you spend a lot of time working in Revit, then you will no doubt discover that screen real estate often becomes a premium. So there's a few different ways that you can manage your interface to adjust it to your liking. And one of the things that we can do is adjust the way the palettes are organized on the screen. So this would include the properties palette and the project browser that we talked about in the last two movies, but it would also include other palettes that you can display as well. So if we look over here at the left-hand side of the screen, I have my properties palette above my project browser in the default configuration. This is how it would install out of the box. But with either of these, you can actually come over here to the title bar, click and hold down your mouse, and tear it away from the dot location on the screen. Now you'll see this big gray border, and when I let go, you'll see that now the project browser is a floating palette. And you can see that I can easily move that around on screen. Now, the only disadvantage of that is that it actually covers up the drawing window underneath. So the best use of tearing it off in this fashion would be if you actually have two monitors connected to your screen. So nowadays, a lot of folks have double monitors. And so if you do have that, you can actually tear off both of these palettes and put them on the second screen. And then your view window can be a nice full screen view. So that's definitely something you can do. Now, of course, you'll also notice that the properties palette is still docked on your left. And so it now fills up the entire vertical part of the space. Now, you can dock these palettes to any of the four sides of the screen. And so if I grab this floating palette and I start to move it to the edge here, notice that it wants to dock to the upper portion of the screen. Or if I drag it to this edge down here, it will want to dock to the lower portion of the screen. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that with a project browser because as you can see, it significantly reduced the size of the view window. And unless you have really long view names, all of this space over here to the right is just empty white space. So I would think that the best place for your project browser and your properties palette would be on the vertical sides of the screen or on the separate monitor. Now, some folks prefer to organize their Revit screen this way, where they have a properties palette on one side and a project browser on the other, and they benefit from both of them being the full height of the screen. So that's another configuration that's very popular. Here's another option. I'm going to pull this back off again. And this one is a little bit trickier to get used to. So you're going to want to pay very close attention to the on-screen cues when you do this next thing. So I've got my browser floating, and I'm going to start to drag it. Notice that I get this big gray box that sort of simulates the shape of the palette. If I move it over here towards where the properties is, pay attention to the shape of the gray box and notice that it's now a much longer and thinner rectangle. If I were to let go, it will actually dock on there as a very narrow window and it puts itself next to the properties palette. Now you can always put your mouse here and adjust the width of it. So again, if you want, you can put them side by side like that. But let's peel it off again and look at another alternative. If I take this and I start to drag it, the first thing we start to see is what I just showed you, that it's going to try and dock on like this. Here's the trick. Don't pay attention to the gray box so much. The gray box is the feedback for the end result that you're going to get. You want to pay attention to where your mouse pointer is. If I look where my mouse pointer is, notice that as I move it up just underneath the title bar of properties, it's actually going to dock it on top of the properties palette. Let me tear it off again. Let me shrink this down a little bit narrower here. Now, suppose I take this and drag it down here. Okay, now it would give me below the properties palette. And then finally, if I put it right on top of the toolbar of the properties palette, you can see where my mouse is. It's on that blue bar. You can kind of see at the very bottom a little gray line that kind of has a step in it. And what that's going to do is it's actually going to put the two palettes on top of each other and tab them. So when I let go, notice that I get a tab here for properties and another tab here for project browser. And if I click, it switches between the two. So if you don't have two monitors, but you don't like having the palettes stacked on top of each other and really short, you can make them full screen height like this and tab them. The only downside is that you have to remember to click the tab to switch between the two. So it really is just a matter of preference which one of these you choose, but there's a lot of different options that are available to you. I'm going to tear this off one more time, and I just want to reiterate, it's the mouse pointer that you want to follow. So again, if I do this right below the title bar, it stacks. Right on the title bar, it gives me a tab. So that's how you know which one you're going to get. I'm actually going to put it back down here, right underneath my properties palette where it started off. And for the remainder of the course, I'm going to leave it in its default position. But you are welcome to use any of those methods that I just showed you and move the two palettes to any configuration that suits your own personal preference. In this movie, I want to talk about an alternative way to execute commands using keyboard shortcuts. So we've already talked about in previous movies that you can go to the ribbon, you can click on the various buttons to execute commands. But in some cases, it's going to be easier to actually just use the command from your keyboard. And many of the commands in Revit actually have keyboard shortcuts. I want to show you how you can learn where the shortcuts are. So the easiest way is to pay attention to the tooltips that appear on your mouse when you put your mouse over one of the commands on the ribbon. So for example, here's the wall command right here. Now, you'll notice a behavior about tooltips in Revit is that when you first highlight the object, the tooltip just gives you the name and a brief description. When you leave it there just a little bit longer, it expands the tooltip open to a more detailed description. So let me show you that again here with the door command. See, a brief description, and then it expands open. Now notice with both of these, next to the name of the command, this is door, in parentheses it says DR. And over here with wall, this is the wall button, and in parentheses it says WA. Those are the keyboard shortcuts. So in addition to using the tooltips to just help you learn about the command, the tooltips will also tell you whether there's a keyboard shortcut associated with that command. So if I move my mouse back out here into the drawing window without clicking the button, if I wanted to execute the wall command, I would just type WA. Now this is very important. Don't press the enter key. You just simply type the two letters, W and A. That's it. If you press enter, what that actually does is it repeats the last command. So whatever command you did before you were trying to run the wall command, it will run the wall command, then it will immediately cancel it and run the previous command. So in my case, if I press enter, the last command that I did was the align command. You see how it jumped me to the modify tab, and it's now highlighted the align command right here on the ribbon, and you can see that my cursor has changed to an align command. Now that will be frustrating if you're not expecting that behavior. If I type WA enter thinking I'm going to get the wall command and instead I'm getting the align command, I might be puzzled as to what's going on. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm going to press escape key 2 times here to cancel all the way out, and I'll go back to the architecture tab again. So most of the commands here on the ribbon are going to have keyboard shortcuts, but not all of them. So as I page through these, you'll notice that roof by footprint, for example, does not have a keyboard shortcut. Now, if you create lots of roofs by footprint and you want the roof by footprint command to have a keyboard shortcut, you can actually customize your Revit environment to include a shortcut for the roof command. You would do that by going to the View tab, come over here to the User Interface dropdown, and choose the keyboard shortcut command. Now, if you look at the tooltip for the keyboard shortcut command, notice that it actually has a keyboard shortcut. So you can actually type KS to get to this dialog as well without having to go through the ribbon. And then here you'll get a complete list of all of the commands in Revit, and you'll see whether or not they already have shortcuts associated with them. Now here I've stopped at properties, and you'll notice that properties actually has 3 different shortcuts. So it's actually possible to assign more than one shortcut key to a command, and you can use whichever one you prefer. So in this case, I could type PP, I could do Control 1, or I could type VP, and they would all do essentially the same thing. What you want to be careful of is not assigning the same shortcut to two different commands, because in that case, Revit will only execute one of the commands, not both. So even though you've assigned a shortcut, it won't ever get to the second command. So try to make sure that you are familiar with the existing shortcuts before you assign a new one. I'm not going to actually create any here. I'm going to simply cancel out. Before I do that, though, if you want, you can actually choose export here to create a text version of this list and use that as a cheat sheet for the shortcuts if you like. I tend to prefer just looking at the tooltips and running them that way, but both methods would work. So if you prefer to use the keyboard to execute your commands and not click through the ribbon tabs as much, you absolutely can do that in Revit. Just look for the keystroke that you need. Make sure you type the two keys without the enter key. Very important that you don't use the enter key, and that will execute the same command without you having to find it on the ribbon first. This movie, we're going to look at view navigation. View navigation is a critical part of any graphics software program, and Revit is certainly no exception. So I'm going to show you ways that we can zoom the screen to change magnification, pan to slide around or scroll the screen, and to orbit when we're looking at 3D views. So I actually have a 3D view open here right now. We can look at all three of those: zoom, pan, and orbit. Now, the first way I'm going to show you how to do that is to just simply use the wheel on your mouse. Now, if your mouse does not have a wheel, I would highly recommend that you get one that does, because it will pay for itself in the first few minutes of its use. To zoom, you simply roll the wheel. So if I roll the wheel down, it will zoom out, and if I roll the wheel up, it will zoom in. It's that simple. Wherever your mouse is, that will become the center of the zoom. So notice here that my mouse is nearby this curb here in the parking lot, and that's what I'm zooming in and out on. If I instead move my mouse over here, don't click anything, but just sort of move the mouse in this vicinity, now it's zooming in and out on the entrance wall here in this building. So that's the easiest way to zoom in and out. To pan, you take the wheel and you press and hold it down. So you're just pushing it in, and then you can drag in any direction to pan the screen. Now, there are scroll bars here on the sides of the screen, and honestly, I never use them. Okay, so they work exactly the way you'd expect them to work, but I think it's just so much easier to use your wheel there and that middle button. Now, you can also use that middle button to orbit the screen. So because I'm in a 3D view here, I can spin this model around and look at it from another vantage point. To do that, I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and then I'm going to drag with the wheel. And you notice that the cursor changes from this, which is a pan shape, to this, which is a orbit shape. And now you can see that I'm spinning the model around. Now, this only works in a three-dimensional view. So if I come over here and I open up, say, a level 2 floor plan, and I want to zoom in a little, that I can roll the wheel just like I did before. If I want to pan, I can do just like I did before. But if I hold the Shift key down and try to orbit, it will just pan. Now, that's by far the fastest and easiest way to navigate your Revit views, is to use one of those three methods with the wheel. But there are other ways that you can navigate the screen as well. So staying here in this 2D view, let me show you some of the options. Over on the right-hand side of my screen, I have a small ghosted out toolbar, which is called the navigation bar. Now, if I move my mouse nearby it, notice that it starts to light up. So when you get in vicinity of that toolbar, it will become full intensity. So when you move away, it's kind of light, and then it gets full intensity. There's two navigation controls here. There's a steering wheel, and there's this view drop down. And I'm going to show you this view drop down right here. If you click the small little icon beneath it, it shows you that there are several different ways to zoom. Now, the default one is zoom in region, and you can see that by the check mark next to it. You can't actually choose it off the menu to run the command. You have to actually click the icon. So there's zoom in region, and if you watched the previous movie, we talked about keyboard shortcuts. Notice that there's a keyboard shortcut for this command as well, which is ZR. So I can do it either way. I can click the button or I can type ZR. And I'll get a little magnifying glass, and then you basically define a rectangle, and it will zoom in on that rectangle. So it's pretty straightforward, but that's how you do zoom in region. Now, the next one down is zoom out 2 times. Now, a peculiar behavior of this little drop down is if you're choosing a command off this menu that's not the current one, then it will execute the command as you choose it. So watch when I choose zoom out 2 times. It actually executes the command and makes that the button on the top of the list. Now, if I tried to pick it off the menu again, nothing would happen. If I wanted to zoom out 2 times the second time, this time I would click the icon or type the letters ZO. So you can use the keyboard shortcuts or you can use the little icons. And in fact, every one of these zoom commands has a keyboard shortcut. They all start with Z, and then it's the first letter of the next word in the name. So ZR for zoom region, ZO for zoom out, ZF is zoom to fit, ZF, and you can see that fits the screen. Now it does fit all the way out to these elevation markers here. So it didn't fit to just the building model, it fits to any geometry in the view. Zoom all to fit, I could only show you if you had more than one window open on screen. So if I take this little icon right here, which is the windows, we've got minimize, maximize, and close here. This one in the middle, restore down, that drops the window down to a floating window. And notice that I got other windows open in the background, like an axonometric view in my level 2, and then whatever this window is here. Well, if I do the keyboard shortcut for tiling these windows, that would be WT, or I could click this icon right here, and that will tile all 3 windows on the screen. Well, now if I type ZA, it's going to zoom all of those windows to fit. So if you're ever in a situation where you have multiple windows open on the screen, you can zoom them all to fit with a single command. Now let me go back here to my level 2 floor plan. I'm going to maximize that again, zoom to fit again, and let's look at the last one, which is zoom to sheet size. Now, zoom to sheet size is actually one of my favorites. What I'm going to do first is zoom in region around this general area, and then I'm going to do zoom to sheet size, which would either be choosing it here off the menu or typing ZS. Now, when you do, it makes a slight adjustment to the view. This command makes the view window match the size that it will be when it prints. So it's called zoom to sheet size, but I actually like to think of it as zoom to scale. Now, if you look down at the bottom left-hand corner of my view window, you can see that the scale of this view is 1 to 50. So at 1 to 50, this door right here, which is, if I hover over it, you can see the last part of the tooltip. It's 900 millimeters by 2400 millimeters. So it's 900 millimeters wide from here to here. And if you look at your own screen and imagine about how big 900 millimeters should be when it's printed at 1 to 50, then that's about the right size. Now, I wouldn't suggest taking out your scale ruler and measuring your computer monitor because computer monitors are not as accurate as printed output. But if you did hold up a piece of printed output next to your computer monitor, it'll be really close. And so the purpose of this command is to give you a decent preview of what it's going to look like when it's printed. So if before you work in the file, before you print, if you just do a quick ZS and look at the screen, if everything kind of looks legible and okay, you can trust that it's probably going to look pretty good when it prints. If you do that ZS and everything is all muddled and muddy, maybe you want to make some adjustments. For example, if I were to change the scale here to 1 to 200, notice what happens to all the labels. They get huge, right? Now, if I do ZS, the labels look fine, but everything is overpowering on the screen. Like, I really wouldn't want to print this view right now because it would be very difficult to read anything in the drawing. So this is why ZS can be such a helpful tool to help you make good decisions about what a view looks like before you commit it to paper and waste the time and the paper actually printing it out. So that's why it's one of my favorite commands. I'm going to go ahead and change this back to 1 to 50 here, and then I'll do a ZS again to confirm that this is a much better and more appropriate scale for this view. So as you can see, there's a lot of different ways that you can navigate the views, and there are some others that we haven't talked about yet, but using the wheel is by far your primary view navigation tool, and that's the one you're going to use most of the time. You roll the wheel to zoom, you drag it to pan, and in a 3D view, you can hold the shift key to orbit and spin around. You'll also have the drop down on the navigation bar, which gives you access to some other zoom commands, and all of them have keyboard shortcuts. And between the collection of those tools, you should be able to navigate most views and get into the areas that you need to do your work quickly. before you'll be able to be successful in making manipulations to a Revit model, you're really going to have to master the process of selection. Now, this is not unique to Revit. Any graphics program, selection is a key skill that you have to master. And there's lots of ways that we can select objects in our Revit models. Now, the first clue we have to the methods of selection is actually right on screen when nothing is happening in your Revit project. So if you're not running any commands, you don't have anything selected, and you look down at the status bar at the lower left-hand portion of the screen, you can see that it says click to select, tab for alternates, control adds, and shift unselects. Now, in some previous movies, we've seen the click to select. That's pretty easy. You just simply go over and put your mouse over an object and click, and it will select that object. Now, what I haven't really mentioned in any of those previous movies is if you click to select a second object, it will actually deselect the first. So an important thing to know about selection in Revit is every time you click, you're actually creating a new selection set. Now, if you want to actually add to or remove from the existing selection set, that's where the control to add and shift to unselect comes in. So in this case, if I want to add another wall to this selection, I would hold my control key down, notice the small plus sign that appears next to my cursor, and then click to add that wall, and maybe click to add this wall, and maybe click to add this wall. Now, when I'm done adding walls, if I realize, oh, I didn't actually want the small wall after all, then I'll hold the shift key down. Notice now that I get a minus sign next to the cursor, and then I can click to remove that object from the selection. So click to select, hold the control key to add to it, hold the shift key to remove from it. And then if you remember a previous movie when we were talking about the properties palette, the quantity of selected items will be listed over here, and I currently have 3 walls selected. And I encourage you to always pay attention to that quantity before you move on to the next step to make sure that the quantity matches your expectation. Now, if you click an empty white space, it will clear any selection you have. So another way to think of that is you're always building a new selection when you click. So if your new selection includes 0 items because you're clicking an empty space, then it will replace your current selection with an empty selection, or in other words, it will deselect everything. Now, the other way that you can deselect is to just simply press the escape key or to click the modify tool. So all of those methods will deselect everything. Okay, so now let's talk about the tab key. When you first get ready to select an object, it actually first pre-highlights. So if I move my mouse over this wall, you're going to see it highlighted in my cursor. Now, if I don't click and I just move my mouse away, it de-highlights. See this door here? See this wall here? Okay, so it's just highlighting the object to let me know what will be selected if I click the mouse. Now, if you put your mouse near the object you want to select and it highlights the wrong thing, the way that you get it to highlight the thing that you do want is using the tab key. So the tab will cycle through the available objects underneath your cursor. So if I press the tab here, notice that it jumps from the door to the wall. Now it's important that you press and release tab. You just press it. Don't hold it down like we did with the control and shift. If you hold it down, you get this sort of strobe-like behavior, and that's not what we want at all. So let me start again. I'm going to highlight the door, press tab, and then if I like this selection, I can click to make the selection. So it's really important that you remember that it's basically 3 steps. Highlight, tab, and then click. Sometimes it's highlight, tab, 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 click. So the amount of tabbing depends on what you're trying to select, but the tabbing is always the middle step. You highlight first, then you tab 1 or more times, and then you click. So just keep repeating yourself, highlight, tab, click. A lot of times when beginners have trouble with this because they get out of sequence and they have a hard time. Don't give up on tab selection because it's way too important. So make sure you practice that and get good at it. Now let's look at another place where the tab key is really helpful, something called a chain selection. So I'm going to highlight this wall again and press tab, and notice what it did. It actually looked down the ends of the wall, and if it found another wall touching the end point, it selected that wall as well. Now, this is a very specific type of thing. What Revit means by a chain is touching endpoint to endpoint. Notice that it highlighted the wall on the right because they're touching end to end, forming the corner. It did not highlight the wall on the left or the one at the bottom, which are forming T intersections. Those are not considered chains. So in order for it to highlight the object, they have to touch endpoint to endpoint. Now, in some cases, you can actually get away with a situation that looks like it's a T intersection, but it's actually an endpoint to endpoint. And I've created that over here. So notice that I've got a small wall here, and I've got another one right here. So there's actually two separate walls here. So even though it looks like a T intersection, there's actually two different walls there. So this one would respond to chain selection. So I'm going to highlight one of the walls, press tab, and notice that it finds the chain going all the way around the entire perimeter of the floor plan. It's very powerful. But watch what I can do. If I move my mouse just slightly, it'll highlight a different chain. So in some cases, if you have more than one chain available, just moving the mouse a little bit will toggle between the two different chains. And then when you see the one you want, you click to select. Remember that final click is critical to always make your final selection. One more tab choice here. Here's a door. Here's the wall. Here's the chain of walls. I'm going to keep going. Okay. There is a floor slab. So sometimes you have to tab several times to actually get to the object you want. So again, it's a really important technique that's definitely worth practicing. Now, all of those techniques are useful, but if you want to select a lot of objects, it can be awfully tedious doing it with some of those methods. So another method we have is to use window and crossing selections. Now, these are the so-called box selections. So the way these work is you don't click, you click and drag. So if I take my mouse and I click and drag to the right, I get a solid edge box. Click and drag to the left, I get a dashed edge box. This is called a window when it goes to the right. The dashed one is called a crossing. And here's how they work. A window has to completely surround an object in order to select it. So notice how I'm able to highlight just the plumbing fixtures, for example, inside this room without getting the walls. And if I let go of the mouse, it highlights those objects. Now I got the door too, but I could easily remove that with the shift key. So keep in mind that all of these methods work together and you can use them all together. It's not one or the other. They definitely work together. Now, a crossing would do anything that's touched. So it would get the plumbing fixtures, but it would also get the walls and even the floor slab. So notice that it's a much more inclusive selection with the crossing. But here's an interesting thing. You can hold the shift key and deselect with a crossing. You can hold the control key and add with a window. So there's lots of ways that you can use these techniques together. Now, a final method that I want to share with you is perhaps the most powerful of all. This is the filter method. Here, you're going to select a lot more than you need. So I'm going to select the entire right-hand side of the floor plan. When I look at my ribbon, a filter button appears over here. When I click this, it will display a dialog which will list out each category of object I currently have selected and the quantity over here in this count column. Now, let's say that I was only interested in certain kinds of objects. Maybe I only want the equipment and fixtures and I don't want any of the walls. I could deselect walls. Maybe I don't want this window. I could deselect the window. And when I click OK, it will leave all the equipment and furnishings selected, but it will deselect the walls and the windows. I realize maybe I don't want the doors. I can go right back in the filter. I can take that out as well. So you can fine tune the selection by using this filter method. So that is by far one of the most frequently used and most powerful selection methods that we have in all of Revit. And so you'll find yourself using that a lot because it's a very quick way to get to just what you need, especially in a very cluttered or busy model. So there's lots of different ways you can select objects, and I highly encourage that you take the time to master each and every one, because the more of an expert you are at selection, the more comfortable and the more fluid your Revit experience will be. We have lots of settings that control the way that objects are selected in our Revit models, and while it's a slightly more advanced topic, we want to discuss it now because if you don't have these settings in their default state, then it can make it difficult to select certain elements as we move forward. So what I'm going to do right now is discuss each of the selection toggle settings that we have available to us, describe them briefly, and then in future movies, we'll look at them in more practical applications as appropriate. I'm in a level 2 floor plan here, and I've kind of created a situation where each of the selection toggles is represented. Now, this isn't necessarily always going to be the case. Now, there's a few elements here that we haven't talked about yet. We've got some grid elements over here, which we'll discuss in a future movie. We've got a Revit link model over here, which we'll discuss in a future movie. So a link model is just another Revit project that's been brought into the current project, and grids are just where the column locations are and so on. So you can also see that we've got this gray geometry here in the middle of the floor plan, and that's something called an underlay. So that kind of quite literally represents what you could do in hand drafting, where you put one sheet underneath the current sheet and used it for reference. Each of these types of objects has some special control over the way that we can select them. So you can actually isolate certain types of objects and prevent them from being selected in the model. So let's start with this linked element out here, which represents the site plan for our building. There's two places you can find the selection toggles. They're at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, represented by several little icons. And the other place is up on the ribbon directly beneath the Modify tool. And that's actually a small drop-down on the Modify panel. Now, the very first icon here is labeled Select Links. And we can see that over here as well with Select Links. And notice that there's a check mark next to this. This means that I should be able to click directly on the linked object, and it will in fact select. You can see it highlights in that sort of blue color there, and then I could make manipulations to that object. Like, for example, I could move it. Now, it's probably not desirable to have somebody move the site plan. So what I'm going to do is click my undo tool here to reverse that. And a way that we can easily prevent that from happening accidentally is by just simply turning off that select links option. Now notice when I uncheck it here, a small little red X will appear on top of that icon at the bottom right-hand corner. So it works the same way. You can either toggle it there with the little icon, or you could check or uncheck it in the dropdown. They both do the same thing. And now notice that I'm not able to select this link file no matter what I do. So the main reason to bring it up early like this is if you're trying to select an object in your model and it's not working, then what that tells you is that you have one of the selection toggles toggled off where you should have it toggled on. So the next toggle over is underlay. So for example, this gray geometry that we see here, I'm going to zoom in so that we can get a better look at it. That represents the floor plan down below. I'm actually on the second floor, but I'm seeing down below the restrooms and some of the offices on the floor plan below. Well, if I wanted to select those elements, currently I can't do that. Now, in a lot of cases, that might be desirable for underlays because you're just using it for reference. But if for some reason you did want to be able to select that geometry, then again, we can just simply toggle that feature there or here, select underlay elements, and now notice that these underlay elements highlight and are selectable. Okay, so that's the underlay elements. I'm going to toggle that back off. The next one is pinned elements. Now, a pinned element is something that you can partially do manually. Okay, so for example, this wall right now is not pinned, but if I select this grid, it is pinned. You see this little push pin here? Now, the pin is used when you want to prevent an object from accidentally being moved. So notice that even though I can select this grid, I can't currently move it. Okay, and that's because it's pinned. Now, if I unpinned it, then it can move. I'm going to undo that with Control Z. But as long as it's pinned, here's the icon right here, it can't be moved. With the selection toggle, not only will it not be movable, but it won't be selectable as well. So as you can see, each of these toggles isolates certain groups of objects and prevents them from being selected. And the main reason for doing that is to prevent accidental modifications to your model. So as projects get more complicated and more complex, you're going to want to consider the condition of these various selection toggles. Now, what we want to do for now is make sure that we can select each of these items, and then we will toggle them off as necessary in the future movies. So on your own Revit, before continuing, make sure that you can select links, you can select underlays, and you can select pinned elements. And if you've got those three checked, then we'll be good to go moving forward.